Morning all. I'd like to show you a wonderfully instructive game from Raul Capablanca. It was played against the British player Harry Golombek, played in Margate 1939. I think it really demonstrates a concept of the minority attack. So that's different from the film Minority Report or whatever. The minority attack is when you get a minority of pawns attacking a majority of pawns to inflict structural damage. So I'll make that clear, this concept, I hope, a little bit with this example game. D4 from Capablanca, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, we have bishop b4, queen c2, d5, white takes on d5, e takes d5. So in taking on d5, of course, white has liberated this bishop a little bit. But how useful is this bishop actually on this diagonal? Black's structure is more fixed. That pawn on d5 is under pressure. White exerts more pressure indirectly by pinning the knight. The minority attack idea, though, is when black plays c6, we'll see that black has a majority of pawns over here, and in fact in this position c6 is now played. This minority of pawns is a pawn chain which can be attacked. The exploitable base is this c6 pawn usually. The most exploitable base is where you can actually in practice attack the pawn chain. Ideally you'd want to attack it here because then this and this would crumble. By undermining the pawn chain, the pawns generally become weaker. But this is the exploitable base of the pawn chain, the c6 pawn in this position. And the minority attack generally tries to attack the c6 pawn. And if it can be removed, then this pawn and this pawn become much weaker and prone to just being won by force. So the minority attack usually involves something like going for b5 later. So how does white go about this? He plays e3 to start off with, which is a logical development just to put the bishop here. Knight bd7, bishop d3. And now there's a little tactic to make note of. If black just castled, then bishop takes h7 check. We've got that pin, so that's annoying. We can't do that without losing the queen. So that's why I think h6 is played, bishop h4, and now black is safe to castle. Now white simply plays knight f3. Okay, rook e8. Now white castles. Bishop e7. And here, another little tricky move from Capablanca. He plays actually bishop g3. And you might think, isn't it possible to win this bishop with knight h5? If knight h5 was played, can you see what white can play if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video here, starting from now? Okay, knight takes d5. Tactics are very important behind the scenes, and they'll make any kind of strategy and the lead up to any strategy and implementation of any strategy a lot more smooth and easy to win the game. Yeah, knight takes d5 is a very useful tactic here. So if c takes, bishop c7 checkmates the queen. Basically, if knight takes g3, we can interpose the check and we've just won a pawn. So the tactics are behind the scenes. Even if you want to be a great positional player, the tactics are always behind the scenes here. So knight f8 was played. That might help explain why knight h5 wasn't played. So h3 now. So now on knight h5, we can just tuck the bishop here. And it's useful actually to have the bishop on this diagonal controlling the b8 square. In relation to the theme that I've set out, the minority attack, you can see that this queenside pressure is going to be useful in principle if white can build up later soon with b5 to try and cause that fracture at the exploitable base of the chain, which is the c6 pawn. It will take a lot longer to go for a6. So this is a quick way to put queenside pressure on black. Black now uses this bishop, but it's a passively placed bishop, bishop e6, as if adding some solidity to d5. But now rook ab1. So white is preparing this classic minority attack. Players with black often try and discourage b5 by playing things like a6 or getting a knight onto d6, but it's difficult to maneuver a knight to d6 here to try and discourage this b5. It seems to be coming quite quick at black in this position. Will it be that devastating? Why can't black play c5 in response? These are questions which need to be answered. So knight h5 was played here. This might not be the best. Bishop drops back, so it's still exerting influence down this diagonal. g6. And in fact, b4 could be playable here, but actually it was delayed a little bit more. Knight e5. Okay. So now we see knight g7 from white. b4 now. So here it is. The whole plan from white to attack this pawn chain at the exploitable base, that c6 pawn. Difficult for black to slow this down in this position. I think if a6, it is compromising a bit the dark squares. Knight a4 actually might be another way of playing. If white doesn't want to go for b5, just go for the dark square here for knight c5. This dark square concession might be enough. Just the threat could be stronger than the execution of b5 here. That's a Nh5 saying, if a6 has been played, for example this position, let's give black a move here. White sits very nicely indeed here in this position. It's very, very passive. And if ever like taking here, then this is absolutely lovely, putting pressure on b7. If black's committed to a very passive defense, then again a4 now might be good for b5. So we can actually combine both dark square play and b5. I think also a4 might be quite okay as well, just going for b5. But it would be nicer to have first the knight on c5, a little bit more of an improvement actually. Here, one thing to look out for potentially is giving the rook a bit of activity. b5 here might not be totally devastating for black. Say takes a8. So a bit of cynicism is needed in this position. If black's able to play c5, that's another good reason to lock down c5. Then the impact of the minority attack isn't so straightforward. It's only a small advantage for white. Damage really hasn't been done. So it's actually upgrading the whole plan to stick a knight on c5 first and then play for the fracture, actually, if we get to the nitty gritty of it here. If on this variation with a6. So if we put a knight first on c5, just to try and make it as effective as possible. Say black wasn't doing anything, we stick a knight on c5. We cause piece passivity because white doesn't want to open up that rook. And then we go for a4 here. It's just a lot stronger than before. I think b5 looks a lot stronger now. This position, maybe white takes here first. And even here, I mean, some damage has already been done to d5, so even here it might not even be the strongest to take here, because the specifics of the position, there's a pin on the loose piece on c2, so the nuances always need to be factored in. So it could get a bit hairy here to have to sacrifice a piece. But even this position, though, is strong, apparently. But a more cautious method here, some fracture has already been created. We can get out of the pin to take account of the tactical nuances of the position. And this looks a lot more straightforward. So we're on d5 now. If takes here, for example, queen takes d5, the damage has been done. We've won a centre pawn, so we've got more centre pawns. And we're on b7 here. In any positional plan, you know, taking account nuances and loose pieces, that's part of the whole position. So we can't just abstract, distill to say a minority attack will win the game. It's taking account of nuances. There's already some structural damage done after c takes. So in this position, yeah, specific moves like taking here first and then queen b3, or a takes now, with this very, very clever idea of a piece sack, takes account of tactics. So here, for example, we can take and we can get a fantastic passed pawn which is in white's favour, for example like this. Ouch. So that's another thing to look out for, dangerous passed pawns as well. But in the game, yes, after b4, so a6 wasn't played, we see the move bishop f5. Capablanca does go for blockade on c5 first to make this b5 more effective in this position, in this particular position. If he plays b5 here, let's say bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, this looks good for white as well, actually. If on the event of c5 we can play d takes here and we've got frontal pressure on d5, we're going to be winning d5. So this is a nice position as well. But Capablanca's move is also very strong, knight a4. So he's going for this pressure first, this blockade pressure first. Black now took on d3, queen takes d3. Now we see knight d7. Again here, b5 needs to be considered, but the response c5 needs to be factored in. It was delayed here. White played rook fc1. Let's have a look here on b5. Well, if c5, we can take here and we've got frontal pressure on d5. So knight takes here. This is a good position. Knight g4. We're actually threatening the h6 pawn, for example. And there's a neat tactic, I think, on d5 here. If king h7, we can play queen takes d5 because of this knight f6 check. So the d5 pawn is tactically actually quite loose in this position. Black's best might be h5. And white can still play this tactic and still have a small advantage. But there's more clear-cut ways of playing this position. In this position, it's not such a fantastic deal. The way it was played by Capablanca here, so instead of the immediate b5, plays actually rook fc1. So tying down Black's response for c5 even more before this b5. It's all to do with making b5 as effective as possible. We've got the basic principle of inflicting structural damage at the exploitable base of the pawn chain, but the implementation needs to be sharp. And when we say sharp, making it as effective as possible, that b5 break, to break that pawn chain. So rook fc1, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and now Black tries to simplify further with bishop d6. This looks like a bit of a feeble move. Instead of this, if a6 trying to stop b5, knight c5 though is passive, queen c8. Once we get the queen passive like this, then it would seem we've got to take account of tactical vulnerabilities though. On a4 b5 this might be loose to bishop c5. Let's have a look. a4, there might be b6 here, and then actually nuances of the position dictate bishop takes b4, and this isn't such a big deal. So much for the concept. It's blown away there if a4 is played routinely. But in this position, queen d2, so we're adding support for this if this knight needs to go back either to d3 or b3 now, giving that d3 square. And this is a much better implementation. And then we can play a4. Any b6 we can put the knight on d3, and we've got pressure now on c6 with b5 to follow. It's a lot about the nuances of the position to actually follow this strategic plan to great effect. So anyway, here a6 wasn't played. It's an attempt to slow down the minority attack. That's why I feel it needs to be analysed for the sake of this thematic video. So yeah, on a6, knight c5, queen c8, queen d2 is cautious, but it's preparing a4 and b5. and white will have great advantage there eventually. But okay, in the game bishop d6, white took on d6, doesn't mind the simplification, and now here with good control of the c5 square, with no horrible pins, no pawns being dropped off, no forcing moves which win material, white is free to play this absolutely thematic looking b5 here. It's a very, very effective time for the b5 break. So the promised advantages, where are they? Well, okay, here black took on b5. This might not be the most stubborn way to keep things solid. Rook ec8, if that was played, we can take here. After takes, we can actually, okay, black can celebrate that his pawns are not that split up. There isn't so many isolated pawns, but on the other hand, knight c5 in its own right is really a very strong advantage for white. A rook infiltration to follow could build up the advantage. If something like rook here, then queen a6, and we can see we're putting black under great scrutiny on the queen side. This is very unpleasant for black, and white could forcibly almost win material now by taking here knight a4, and this is starting to be very nasty. a3 first to kick the rook, and now we can finally take material here, and this endgame position looks very promising, with d5 now a massive weakness and about to drop off. So this will be a winning endgame with white having the centre pawns. So that's just an example here in this position. Even if rook ec8 was played more stubbornly to keep the pawn chain intact, it'd still be good for white. But black plays c takes b5, so he's fractured the pawns now, more volunteered for that position. Queen takes b5, so put pressure on these two pawns. Knight e6, at least trying to control the c5 square, but offering the b7 pawn. b7 could actually be taken here, it seems. This isn't much of compensation, this position. If takes here, white can take on a8, that's the strongest, and have a nice endgame here. Again, you see this pawn's weak and this pawn's weak, so white's going to play knight c3 soon and put pressure on d5. Okay, so if we go back, queen takes b7 wasn't played. Another strong move though, knight c3, just putting pressure on d5. So you can see that they're both weak now. The idealistic concept of the minority attack was played in a non-idealistic fashion. It was played with great attention to the finesses, the practical realities of the position, to get this position without black having some horrible forcing moves, etc. And maybe a lot of us have this frustration when we see these model plans and strategic ideas, and we always think, why is it failing tactically? How did the masters make it look so easy? Capablanca has very carefully and delicately made sure that the forcing move sequences and the other stuff didn't happen. You can see that illustrated because he put an emphasis into trying to control the c5 square first before inflicting b5. In this position now, d5 under great pressure, white threatening, taking the pawn here and taking the pawn either like this or this. Black played this, and Capablanca took the b7 pawn now. Queen a3, and the game actually didn't last that long here. Something horrible was about to happen tactically, not just losing the pawn. So both pawns wiped out. Mission accomplished. Black, though, thinks he can get one pawn back. Okay, so there's only one pawn down. In this position, though, it's pretty bad. Knight b4 hitting the queen. And here, queen a4 was played. This is not the best response, but it's a very bad position anyway. On queen a3, knight c6, and what does black do? The rook can't move there, it's controlled by the knight. If it goes there, knight e7, check, ouch. And if it goes here, this is good for white still. Say with knight e5 on f7, it's very passive for black, this position. Extra pawns in the centre. White dominates the position. Say queen d5 with rook b7 to follow, and it's nice to get a rook on the 7th, and f7 is the exploitable target now. Next. Okay, but black actually accelerated his demise by playing queen a4, and unfortunately this allows knight c6 with the idea of trapping the queen now, and the queen is in big trouble. It actually is difficult to save it. a6 trying to give the b5 square might be best, just losing the exchange, but this is hardly playable against the player of Capablanca's strength. So in this position, after knight c6, Harry Golombek resigned. I hope you got something out of this, that minority attack is a fantastic fundamental idea, but you have to take account of the nuances of the position. You have to make sure the opponent hasn't got lethal forcing moves or forcing moves that win material. You need to make sure you guarantee a strong advantage. The advantage might not be what you've originally set out, which is to break the structure. It might be intact, but you might get the c5 square. So you need to look out for the kind of alternative advantage goals of playing for the minority attack that you might get, and celebrate those as well as an alternative. Not be too disheartened if you haven't achieved the structural damage, but you might have achieved just pressure on the queen side, which will lead to a win anyway. I hope you got something from it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.